Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be back. I think my third time here at the Institute, and to see Mr. President again. It's a highlight of my trip in Brazil. If I'm not here, it feels like I haven't really come to Brazil. So thank you for welcoming me and being here. This guy travels more than I do, I think, which is incredible. Well, when you get me another couple decades, and I'm going to aspire to maintain what you're doing. So thank you. We've just been talking about populism. And during Q&A, I can talk about anything you want, but this is the new piece that's worrying people. This is what everyone's asking about. This is what I want to discuss. Because those of you that have followed me for years now know that what I've been talking about for 6 or 7 years was this geopolitical recession, the G0. The U.S. withdrawing from global leadership, but no one else taking the global reins, and so free trade fragmenting, and international security fragmenting, and institutions eroding. Obviously, with the election of Donald Trump and America First, that is speeding up, right? The G0 is now here, and it's bigger, and it's sharper, and it's a little more dangerous than I expected because of the Trump election. That's true. But then you have this new piece, which is not the top down. It's not the U.S. withdrawing. It's the bottom up. It's the citizens looking at their governments and saying, we find this unacceptable. We do not think that our political leaders are legitimate. We do not trust the institutions. We don't trust the media. We don't trust the public intellectuals. We don't trust the CEOs. We don't trust the bankers. And this is exactly what happened in the UK with Brexit. It's what happened in the United States with the elections. It's happening across the developed world. And I think it's going to happen globally. And there are a lot of reasons for it, right? I mean, this is essentially the backlash of globalism. Open borders, free trade, freer movement of peoples, all then causing a whole bunch of working and middle classes, particularly in the developed world, saying, well, what about us? You guys made a lot of money, your share prices did well, but what about us? And the what about us is not just an economic issue. What about us is a security issue, thinking that Mexicans are dangerous and they're going to come and rape your women, or that Muslims are dangerous and they need to be kept out, right? In Europe, you hear a lot of that. It's about jobs and about the future of whether or not there'll be opportunities, about institutions and infrastructure that don't work. It's about health care. It's about the opioid addiction in the United States. There's so many components of this. And it's clearly going to get bigger. And it's going to get bigger, one, because the central governments won't respond to it effectively, and two, because of the technology. The technology that shows you that over the course of the next 10 years, I don't know if there'll be more jobs or less jobs. The jury is out on whether new technology will create new jobs. But what I know is even if there are more jobs, those jobs will require skills that the dispossessed will not have. So you will have to train them or they will stay dispossessed. I was meeting with Jeff Bezos a couple weeks ago from Amazon, pretty impressive guy. And he told me that the reason that they are creating a second headquarters in North America, and by the way, he said North America to me 3 times, not US, he said North America. He wants to be very clear that Canada and Mexico are open for business as far as Amazon is concerned. And he wants Trump to hear that. He wants Trump to hear that because he does not like Mr. Trump one bit, right? And he said, look, I've got 6,000 jobs right now in Seattle that I cannot fill. I can't even find people I can train to do these jobs. They're not even close. So I got to do something else, right? So in that environment, we know that we're going to see far more people that feel dispossessed, that feel the American dream, the European dream, do not apply to them. So the big question is what's going to happen? How are we going to respond? And let me argue that there are really three potential responses, right? The first response is you ignore it at your peril. You fall apart. Revolution, violence, social discontent. That's one possible outcome. The second possible outcome is you address it. You fix it. You spend the money. You raise taxes if you have to. You build the infrastructure. You remember these people that have not been doing so well, and you go in and train them. You give them lifetime training, right? That's the second possibility. Then there's the third possibility. The third possibility is you create more effective differentiation. You wall off the people that are a problem. Both you wall them off physically, you also wall them off virtually. Let me suggest to you that over the next 10 years, we're going to see all three of those responses. And furthermore, that it's kind of obvious where we're going to see them. So there will be some poorer, badly run, frontier-type markets that are just going to fall apart. And they'll fall apart more quickly. This is what happened in Yemen. It's what happened in Syria, right? It's why the Tunisian revolt occurred. It's the governments weren't getting it right. The people more empowered with technology. The government didn't have the technology to actually know how to stop them, and so there was a lot of bloodshed, right? And clearly, in an environment where more people are left behind, you will see this happening in certain pockets of dispossessed people and bad governance around the world. The good news is, for most of you in this room, this is not going to affect you. We don't go to those countries, right? We don't live there. We're not tourists there. We don't really invest there. These are places that don't really have much effect. It's kind of looking at climate change. And the people that are most affected by climate change, who are they? They're the people that are living in the worst places. It's Bangladesh. It's, you know, it's all of the extreme climate conditions in sub-Saharan Africa. It has an effect, absolutely. But the worst effect is felt by the people that are least capable of responding to it. So that's one response. Second response, let's get it right. Let's be clear. The US as a country is not going to get it right. Germany as a country is not going to get it right. France, are you kidding me? Italy, no way, right? UK, no, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't get it right anywhere. But I mentioned climate change. Structural inequality is like climate change. For decades, we knew climate change was coming. We all knew. The science was there. But we also knew that we didn't have the answer. The answer was probably going to be really expensive. It was going to take a long time. And there was no urgency. So let's give it to our kids, right? And so governments for decades just didn't do it. We went to the meetings. We went to the meetings in Copenhagen and Cancun and Durban, and we failed. But as human beings, we did do something. Since the governments weren't getting anything done, you had CEOs and philanthropists and billionaires. You had mayors and some governors, and they tried different things, many of which failed. And some of the experiments that succeeded couldn't become big enough. But some of the experiments started to work. And now we are 2017. And in 2017, solar power is actually cheaper than coal in much of the world during the day when the sun is shining. Now, that's extraordinary given where we were 10 years ago. It's extraordinary given how little has been done by governments. And yet here we are. I think I now look at climate change in 20, 30 years, and I now think we have the tools, or soon will, to be able to respond. I think about developments in battery storage and transmission and renewables, and I get excited. I get optimistic. But the problem is, between here and there, we have this horrible U with all of this pain and economic damage and human degradation because the governments couldn't get it right. You know where I'm going with this. This is structural inequality. I see people addressing structural inequality. The CEO of AT&T, big client of ours, I've worked with them for 15 years, has looked at his employees, his workforce all over the world. They said, you know what? You guys don't have the skills to work at AT&T in 5 years' time. You don't have it. We do not want to fire you, but we're going to have to. unless you get training. And if you are willing to do that training outside of working hours, we'll pay for it. And as long as you do the hard work and pass, we're going to keep you employed and find jobs for your new skill sets. Now, I think that's great. And there's no chance at all that the United States government's going to do that. Zero. But there's a chance that a mayor or 2 or 10 are going to look in their cities and work with some CEOs and start doing that. We might even get a governor or 2. It's not bad. I look at what's happening in parts of Denmark and Norway, where they're reducing the work week hours, and they're also creating a gig economy. Technology supported, and saying, look, you guys have skill sets. Those skills, sometimes people really need them, sometimes they don't. It's like Airbnb, it's like Uber. It's labor on demand. When a lot of people need you, you can charge more. If nobody needs you, you're unemployed. We're going to make it really easy for companies to hire and fire you. But we're going to make the tax rate really high. And we're going to make sure that you have the support that you can live through those unemployed periods. We're going to get you better education. We're going to get you better health care. We're going to make maternity and paternity leave the best in the world. And we're going to make you feel included. That works too. I see what Singapore is doing in digital training. That works. So I think that structural inequality over the next 20 years, we'll start to see some of these solutions, grassroots from different parts of the world, including people in this room, coming up with solutions that ultimately will get us to a better place. But, and this is a really big but, what happens until then? I was with Charlie Rose 3 weeks ago, and Charlie Rose organizes this annual little meeting in Aspen, 100 people, and it's a lot of movie stars and stuff, but also some CEOs and some thinkers, and they had a panel on inequality, because as you know, we all have to have panels on inequality right now. And the CEOs were up there, and they're saying, this is a crisis, and we have to do something. And so I asked the first question, and I said, why do you think it's a crisis? I mean, a crisis implies that if you don't do something, you're going to get hurt. No one up there feels that way. I go to Davos. They don't feel that way. They feel like it's a really bad thing. We'd like it to be different, but it's not urgent. It's a chronic condition. You know? You have a relationship with your wife. Urgent is she catches you with another woman. That's a crisis, right? That's a crisis, okay? I'm just trying to create an analogy that feels live in Brazil. So what happens, it works in the US too, don't worry. But I mean, if you're 60, 70, and you've been living with your wife for 20, 30 years, and you aren't talking to each other as much, now you're living in different rooms and sleeping, that's not a crisis. That's a chronic condition that you are not going to address, right? Structural inequality is not the first, it's the latter. And that is really facilitated by technology, right? Technology is going to allow us to build better walls. Let's not kid ourselves. You go to the Middle East right now. Middle East is one of the most screwed up parts of the world, right? We all know that. By far, the best governed place in the Middle East is best governed. Israel. Israel. Of course it is. Right. Israel. It's awesome, right? Great education, right? Anti-corruption. I mean, Netanyahu is probably going to get impeached for stuff that in Brazil wouldn't even make the newspapers, right? Like, you guys know corruption, right? The Israelis are like, no, we cut that right off. They've got great media. They've got an independent judiciary. Even Arabs living in Israel would rather live there than anywhere else in the Middle East. True, because the life quality is so great. There's only one problem. One little problem. Palestinians. If you're Palestinian, you kind of have nothing. And, 10 years ago, people said, oh no, if Israel doesn't give Palestinians a state, then it's all over for them. I am telling you today, Israel's much more sustainable than it was 10 years ago. They don't need to give the Palestinians another state. They don't need the labor. They've got incredible border security. They've got extraordinary human surveillance. And for all of the people in the Middle East that said Israel, Palestine, what used to be a priority, the top priority, you go to Saudi Arabia now, it's not a priority. In fact, the Saudis are working with the Israelis behind the scenes to understand border security and cyber surveillance, because the Israelis do it really well, and the Saudis know they need it, right? Absolutely, these walls are going to grow. It's going to be harder to immigrate places unless you've got money or skills that people need. You got a skill that Amazon needs, you get into the United States. You just a workaday worker, we don't want you. Refugee? I don't think so. You notice the one place in the developed world that doesn't have this populist problem? We never talk about them. They have an election next week, I'm going there. Japan. There's no populism in Japan. You know why? No immigrants. And the population is shrinking. Last year, 10,000 Syrian and Iraqis tried to get refugee status in Japan. You know how many they let in? 8. Should have been 7. 8 snuck in. I don't know how that happened. 8, right? That's like a table, right? That's like an apartment. That's not a refugee situation. So, that's what's stable. Okay, we're clearly going to see over the next 10 years much more dividing of people. And if you're in the business environment, that really matters, because in the world where we thought, oh, it's going to be global middle class, we need to work with the global middle class, now it's different. Now it's a lot of really rich people and a lot of disempowered people. And that changes your business model. And a lot of really great business models keeping them apart. One other thing I want to say, and that is China. You just saw China yesterday, 3.5-hour speech, Xi Jinping. You all know that the average Chinese right now is happier with their government than the average American is with the American government. And this is despite the fact that no one actually votes for Xi Jinping, right? He's just there. And economic growth is a big part of that story. But top-down power is a big part of that story, too. And 2 things I want to say about this. 2 things about technology that make the Chinese model stronger than you thought it was. The first is that when jobs go away and when labor is not very efficient, the Chinese have a model that allows them to hire inefficient people. That's what their system is all about. I wrote this little piece 3 weeks ago about Milton Friedman when he went to China like 30, 40 years ago. The Nobel economist goes to China and he sees a construction site, and there are thousands of Chinese on the construction site, as far as the eye can see, and they have shovels and pickaxes. There are no bulldozers, no cranes, no heavy machinery. So Milton Friedman goes to the guy in the Communist Party, he's bringing him around, and says, what the hell's going on? You're like, why don't you have any bulldozers? He's like, no, you don't understand. We're trying to keep all these people employed. And so Milton Friedman, economist, smart guy, says, I've got a great idea for you. Take away the shovels and give them teaspoons. Because then you could hire even more, right? And of course, everybody laughs, because the American model is so important and so good when we're focused on growth and empowering the free market and big corporations making money. But the dirty secret is that most Americans aren't capitalists because they don't have capital, right? Most Americans just want a job that they can be paid for, which is why the average Chinese today is happier than the average American. Look, the average rich American is happier than the average rich Chinese. Because the average rich Chinese wants to buy real estate in Miami and Manhattan, send their kids to Harvard, and have air you can breathe, right? So there is an archipelago that is growing, and the Americans will dominate the archipelago. Yes, but for the actual people living in these countries, the Chinese system can both dominate industrial robotics and they can employ, the government, all sorts of inefficient labor, as long as they don't run out of money. Now look, if the Chinese system implodes because of debt or implodes because of a real estate bubble, then we've got problems. But I'm arguing that they have a lot more time than you think. And as long as they have that time, their model is going to look more attractive to much of the world than the American model. That is a game changer. Final point is this. We are right now engaged in an unprecedented social experiment. We basically said, we're going to give all of our children these devices. and we're going to let them interact with the whole world through them. Their friends, their family, education, society, the marketplace, everything. And then let's see what happens when they grow up. Anything could happen. I don't know. It could be good, could be bad. Let's just see, right? Now, here's why this is interesting, right? It's interesting because in the West, the institutions that are responsible for determining your behavior in your interaction with this are companies. And they're companies that want to turn our children into better consumers because that helps them make more money. It's Facebook and Amazon and Apple and Google and all of these monopolies in the United States that do these things, right? And they're very successful at it. In China, the institution that is responsible for determining how you interact with this thing is the government. And the government wants you to consume, but their primary responsibility is to make sure that you behave like a proper citizen, as defined by China. It's about stability and security. It's not first about profit. Now, I do not know which of those two models will end up being more successful. I really don't. But what's interesting is it's not China versus the US. It's China versus Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley right now are a bunch of US corporations that do not feel any loyalty to the United States. They feel a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. Again, game changer. Another thing that gives the Chinese and their model much greater capacity to be resilient. So Frank Fukuyama, writing about the end of history, wasn't just wrong and early. I think this thing, and in 5 years, you know, it's not this. In 5 years, it is augmented reality. In 5 years, it's completely immersive, and it's unstoppable, right? And that is exponentially greater power for the institutions that are able to determine what the algorithms are of what you're going to see. We know all the fake news, all the fragmentation of media, all the ethnic identity getting stronger. You know why that's happening? It's because now media and information, you consume what you like. When you consume what you like, you only see people that already agree with you, that already look like you, that already have your station in life. Now, for me, that's a globalized person who feels very comfortable in Sao Paulo or Singapore. Most people don't feel that way. You guys do, but most people don't. And so, you know, once you have not 1 billion rich people that are globalists online, but you have 7 billion people, most of whom feel disenfranchised, that's a very different story, my friends. And the fact that the Chinese government has made that the strategic sector, and that they wish to dominate AI, and they may fail. Silicon Valley may win, but again, that's not the US government. And I do not believe the US government will be able to effectively rein in Silicon Valley with antitrust. Too slow, don't have the lawyers, don't have the expertise, they're way behind. You can do that with AT&T, because that was a big lumbering organization like the US government. I don't think you can do that with Facebook. So I thought I'd say some provocative stuff. I also want to note, before we go to questions, I want to make note that I did not discuss Trump. Because he's less important. Because these things that are happening are structural. Trump is a symptom. Trump is the natural outcome of the stuff I'm talking about. And we can talk about Trump in questions. I'm happy to. It's important for NAFTA, North Korea. I mean, it's not like Trump doesn't matter. But Trump matters so much less. It's like talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda and 9/11. Let's have a war on terror. Let's just bomb them. And like, if you're not going to fix the underlying conditions, bombing Al-Qaeda just got you ISIS. I mean, the Americans are completely responsible for the emergence of ISIS, right? But, I mean, from a tactical perspective. But that doesn't get you anywhere. We need to understand what we're going to do to stop having these conditions. And if you want to end terrorism, you have to stop creating disenfranchised young Muslim men who feel like they have no alternatives. If you want to stop Trump, you have to stop creating disenfranchised Americans that feel like everyone's lying to them. My brother voted for Trump, right? If my mother were alive, she would have voted for Trump. I grew up in the projects. Everyone I grew up with did not trust the establishment. They said, these people are lying. They're not going to do anything for us. I get that. I don't happen to think a vote for Trump was a good vote because Trump clearly was lying to them, but I understand the desire to protest. I understand the desire, if you're Palestinian, I know why you want to throw a rock, because everything else has been shut down for you. I understand if you're in Guantanamo Bay, or even if you are a hostage taken by the Taliban, I understand why you go on a food strike. And it's because the one thing that they can't take away from you is your right to be an individual. And that's where structural inequality goes. It creates protest votes. And that's an obvious thing. And that's no different in the West. What's different is that technology is making the Israel-Palestine model much more attractive and stable. That's what's different. That's new. And again, I think something that is underappreciated in the political space, at least in my country right now, but hopefully fodder for some very good discussion with all of you here right now.